I always thought fishing was the most harmless hobby a man could have, especially when compared to the wild antics of my neighbors in the subdivision who constantly threw loud parties, parked their oversized trucks on the street, and even let their dogs run wild without leashes. Yet, for some strange reason, the homeowners association had decided that I was the biggest problem in the neighborhood because I liked to sit quietly by the community lake with my fishing rod, a folding chair, and a cooler of sodas, minding my own business as the sun set, and the water shimmered with that golden glow that makes you feel like everything in life is going to be all right. But one afternoon, my peace was shattered when a woman named Janice, the HOA president who took her unpaid role as if she were running a military dictatorship, stormed down the walking path with a clipboard in her hand, barking at me about how fishing was against lake usage policy, a rule she claimed had been put in place to preserve the aesthetic integrity of the community, which I personally translated as, "We don't want you catching the bass that my son pretends to admire when he throws breadcrumbs into the water." At first, I laughed because surely this was a misunderstanding, but the very next day, a letter arrived in my mailbox with a bright red heading that read violation notice and a fine of $200 attached, accusing me of unauthorized exploitation of community resources, which sounded less like fishing and more like I had run an illegal mining operation. And as I sat there staring at the letter, anger boiled inside me, not just because of the fine itself, but because of the arrogance of a group of neighbors who thought they could dictate every little detail of how I lived my life, from what color I could paint my front door to how long my grass could grow to whether or not I was allowed to put Christmas lights on my house before December. I tried to be reasonable, sending a polite email asking for clarification and suggesting perhaps we could have a community vote on fishing rights, but the response I received was smug and dismissive, telling me the rule had been clearly outlined in the HOA bylaws, which nobody ever read when they bought their house because the thing was 200 pages long, written in dense legal jargon, and buried under mortgage paperwork. And then, as if to rub salt in the wound, Janice herself showed up, again a few days later to warn me that if I was caught fishing again, the fine would double and eventually escalate to legal action or even a lien on my property. And in that moment, something inside me snapped because here I was a grown man being treated like a delinquent child for doing something that harmed no one. And instead of just rolling over like most people do when confronted by HOAs, I decided I was going to fight back, not with petty arguments or lawn sign protests, but with something so big, so definitive that it would end the conversation once and for all. And that's when the idea first hit me. If they claimed I couldn't fish in the community lake because they owned it, what if I simply became the owner myself? At first, it sounded like a crazy fantasy, but as I thought about it more and more, I realized it might actually be possible because the HOA didn't technically own the lake outright. The water and surrounding land were managed under a separate entity that leased it to the HOA for community use, and after some digging at the county clerk's office, I discovered that the owner of that entity was an elderly man who had inherited the property decades ago and was now living 3 states away, tired of dealing with the paperwork and constant complaints from the HOA board. I can still remember the excitement in my chest when I found his phone number, dialed it nervously, and heard his weary but kind voice on the other end. And within 20 minutes of conversation, he admitted he'd been thinking of selling the property anyway, because the taxes were a nuisance, and he was more interested in spending his retirement on golf than on handling petty neighborhood politics. That was the moment the spark became a plan. If I bought the lake, every one of those smug HOA members who thought they had power over me would suddenly realize that their kingdom was built on sand because I would be the one setting the rules, and the very first rule I would establish would be simple, direct, and satisfying beyond measure. Fishing allowed anytime, no HOA interference tolerated. Once the idea of buying the lake took root in my mind, it consumed me with a level of determination I hadn't felt in years. Almost like I was on a mission not just to reclaim my right to fish, but to prove to the entire neighborhood that the HOA's power was not absolute. So I began working the phones, calling banks, researching property values, and learning everything I could about how one even goes about purchasing a lake, because unlike buying a house, there weren't exactly dozens of estate listings titled waterfront property, entire lake included, but luck seemed to be on my side because the elderly owner, Mr. Harold Whitmore, was not only willing to sell but eager to unload the responsibility, and when he quoted me a price that was shockingly within reach, especially since the HOA had been nickel-and-diming residents for years under the guise of maintenance fees that never seemed to actually improve anything, I realized that if I restructured some of my savings and pulled a modest loan, I could make it happen. The process itself was surreal, sitting across from Harold's lawyer in a cramped office surrounded by boxes of old property records, signing documents that made me the legal owner of the lake and its surrounding shoreline, the same shoreline where Janice once wagged her finger at me like I was a misbehaving teenager, and the moment the pen left the final page, a wave of exhilaration washed over me because I knew that this wasn't just about fishing anymore. This was about reclaiming dignity, about showing that ordinary people don't always have to bow to the self-appointed tyrants of HOAs. For a few days, I kept the news to myself, savoring the secret like a fine drink, daydreaming about how I would break it to the community, but the truth couldn't stay hidden for long. Because as the new deed holder, I had to file ownership with the county, and once that became public record, it was only a matter of time before word reached the HOA board. Sure enough, the first confrontation happened at the next monthly meeting, which I normally never attended. But this time I walked in wearing a clean shirt and a quiet smile, clutching a neat folder of documents, and sat down right in front of Janice and her band of clipboard warriors. The meeting dragged on with their usual complaints about lawn heights and mailbox paint colors until Janice's eyes finally landed on me, and with her trademark smugness, she asked if I was here to contest another fishing violation, to which I calmly replied, "No, I'm here to inform you that, as of last week, I own the lake." You could have heard a pin drop in that room, the silence stretching out before exploding into a cacophony of disbelief, protests, and angry mutters as I slid copies of the deed across the table for them to see with their own eyes. Janice's face turned red, her jaw clenched as she stammered something about community rights. But I cut her off, explaining in no uncertain terms that the HOA's rights extended only to what they directly managed, and since the lake was now my private property, their so-called rules no longer applied there. Some neighbors gasped, some chuckled, and a few even clapped quietly, clearly tired of Janice's iron-fisted reign. But the best part was watching her deflate as she realized she had no legal leverage over me whatsoever. The days that followed were delicious, waking up each morning and strolling down to the water with my fishing rod, casting my line into the still surface while HOA enforcers stood helplessly on the walking path, glaring but powerless, and each time I reeled in a catch, I'd tip my hat to them with a grin, savoring the sweet taste of victory. Of course, Janice wasn't the type to admit defeat easily, and soon rumors began circulating that the HOA was considering legal action to challenge the validity of the sale, but I had done my homework, consulting lawyers and verifying every clause, and my ownership was airtight, so their threats fizzled like wet fireworks. That's when the idea for the next step hit me, not out of spite, but out of a burning desire to make a point. If they thought they could dictate who could and couldn't use the lake, then I would show them just how much authority I now held, because owning the lake meant I had the power to control access completely, and so with a few calls to a local contractor, I had signs installed around the shoreline, bold and unmistakable, reading, "Private property, access restricted. Fishing by owner's permission only." The uproar was immediate, neighbors pounding on my door, accusing me of being selfish, calling me petty, even comparing me to the very HOA I had just dethroned. But the irony made me laugh because all I had done was flip the script, giving them a taste of the very arbitrary rules they had once shoved down my throat, except this time, instead of a joyless committee dictating nonsense, it was me, one man with a simple principle: if you didn't respect my right to fish, you lost your own. Some people got the message quickly and backed off, while others doubled down, petitioning, arguing, and whining at every turn, but I stood firm, knowing that the satisfaction of reclaiming freedom was worth every ounce of pushback, and each sunset by the water felt like a personal victory celebration, the golden ripples carrying away years of frustration as I cast my line with complete peace of mind. Owning the lake had given me a sense of triumph I hadn't felt in years, but as with any victory, It wasn't long before the opposition regrouped and launched their counterattack, and sure enough, Janice and her loyal band of HOA enforcers began stirring the pot in every way they could, holding emergency meetings, passing out flyers, and even trying to rally the neighborhood against me with dramatic speeches about how I was hoarding a community resource and betraying the spirit of the subdivision, as if my quiet fishing trips were somehow a declaration of war. But what amused me most was how quickly her self-righteous rhetoric began to sound hollow when you considered that it was she who started this feud by slapping me with a $200 fine for sitting by the water with a fishing rod. Still, people are funny creatures, and when you give them a villain to unite against, they'll come out in droves, which is exactly what happened when the HOA circulated a petition demanding I restore open access to the lake. Neighbors who had never even cared about fishing before were suddenly up in arms, knocking on my door with speeches about community spirit and fairness. But I knew the truth. They didn't actually care about the lake. They just didn't like the idea that one man had broken free from the HOA's grip and proven it could be done. Because deep down, many of them resented the constant rules but were too afraid to challenge the system, and my act of defiance made them feel small. The pressure campaign escalated quickly, from angry notes left in my mailbox to passive-aggressive stares whenever I drove through the subdivision, and then one night, while I was sitting on my porch sipping a beer, I heard shouting down by the lake and discovered a group of teenagers trespassing, throwing rocks into the water and deliberately making noise just to mock me, their laughter echoing through the night. And though I considered calling the police, I decided against it, instead walking down calmly and informing them that since this was now private property, I had every right to prosecute trespassers, which immediately wiped the smirks off their faces and sent them scattering into the darkness like startled raccoons. The next morning, however, I found that someone had spray-painted Lake Hog on my mailbox in sloppy red letters, a petty act of vandalism that proved Janice's rhetoric was sinking in with the impressionable and the bitter alike, and though I cleaned it up without much fuss, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of war brewing, like the subdivision had split into factions with me on one side and the HOA loyalists on the other. Not everyone hated me, of course. In fact, a surprising number of neighbors quietly expressed their support, slipping me words of encouragement at the grocery store or giving me thumbs up as they drove past my house, and one older gentleman named Frank even stopped by with a six-pack, chuckling as he told me he'd been waiting for years for someone to knock Janice off her high horse. Still, the louder voices were the angriest ones, and Janice herself seemed determined to make my life miserable, showing up with inspectors claiming my fence was 2 inches taller than regulation or that my grass was an unacceptable shade of green, throwing violation letters at me with a vindictiveness that bordered on obsession. Each time, I countered her with documentation, photos, or outright dismissal, because none of her petty grievances held up against the fact that I was well within my rights, but the constant harassment was exhausting, and I started to realize that this feud wasn't just about fishing anymore. It had become a symbolic battle for control, a test of wills, where only one side could stand victorious in the end. The breaking point came during a heated HOA meeting where Janice unveiled her grand plan to impose a community easement on the lake through legal channels, essentially forcing me to allow open access despite owning it. And though her speech was dramatic and filled with applause from her loyalists, I stood up calmly when she finished, looked her dead in the eye, and presented the thick binder of legal opinions I had gathered from 3 different attorneys, each one confirming beyond any doubt that such an easement would be impossible to enforce without my consent, which I would never give, and the room erupted in chaos, half the crowd shouting in support of me, the other half booing and jeering, until the meeting devolved into a circus that perfectly embodied why I had lost respect for the HOA in the first place. Walking out of that room, I knew the battle had reached its peak, and it was time to deliver the final blow, something that would not only end the debate once and for all, but send a message so loud that even Janice's shrillest protests would be drowned out, because while I had enjoyed the satisfaction of fishing freely, what I truly wanted was to prove a principle: that no one, not even a power-drunk HOA president, could strip away a person's simple right to enjoy life in peace. That night, sitting by the lake under the silver glow of the moon, I began to formulate my plan One that would be bold, controversial, and guaranteed to flip the entire neighborhood upside down. Because if they thought banning me from fishing was harsh, they were about to see what true authority looked like when it was wielded by someone determined to protect their freedom at any cost. The decision came to me with the kind of clarity that only arrives when you're fed up enough to stop caring about ruffled feathers or angry neighbors. Because after weeks of endless harassment, smear campaigns, and petty acts of vandalism, I realized that the only way to silence the HOA for good was to hit them with something so definitive and irreversible that their entire narrative collapsed under its own weight. And so I drafted a simple but powerful document, an official notice declaring that effective immediately, the lake and all surrounding property would be completely closed to neighborhood access, no walking trails, no scenic strolls, no evening jogs, and certainly no fishing except by me or those I personally invited. To enforce it, I hired a local fencing company, and within a week, sturdy signs and locked gates appeared at every entry point, each one stamped with private property and no trespassing. Owner enforces full legal rights. Predictably, the neighborhood erupted like a hornet's nest, with furious posts filling the community Facebook page, angry knocks echoing on my door, and even Janice standing in my driveway one afternoon, her face red as she screamed about lawsuits and community devastation. But I didn't flinch, instead handing her a laminated copy of the deed and trespassing laws, telling her that if she or anyone else set foot past those fences without permission, I'd have the sheriff involved before they could blink. The sheer audacity of my move divided the neighborhood like never before. Some called me a hero for standing up to the HOA bullies, while others called me selfish, petty, even tyrannical. But I found it ironic that the same people who once defended the HOA's right to fine me for fishing were now suddenly screaming about fairness when the rules didn't favor them anymore. And then something happened that made my victory even sweeter. One by one, neighbors who had quietly suffered under Janice's rule began approaching me, offering support, sharing their own stories of unjust fines, arbitrary rules, and power-tripping board members. And before long, a small but determined faction had formed, people who were tired of being pushed around and saw in me a symbol of resistance. I never asked for followers, but I couldn't deny the satisfaction of seeing the mighty HOA board's authority crumble as more and more residents questioned why they were paying dues to an organization that couldn't even control the very lake they once bragged about. The tipping point arrived when the annual HOA election rolled around, and fueled by months of frustration, my faction launched a coordinated effort to vote Janice and her cronies out, using every legitimate proxy and ballot we could gather, and when the final count was read, the gasp in the room was audible. Janice had lost her presidency, ousted by a landslide that no one had seen coming. The look on her face was priceless, a mix of disbelief, fury, and humiliation. And though she tried to storm out with a speech about ungrateful neighbors, everyone knew her reign of petty tyranny was over. In the weeks that followed, the new board, made up of far more reasonable people, reached out to me with olive branches, asking if I'd consider reopening the lake under friendlier terms, but I politely declined, telling them that while I appreciated the gesture, the point of my ownership wasn't to manage another community amenity, it was to protect myself from ever being bullied again, and though I might someday allow limited access, it would only ever be on my terms. That answer seemed to satisfy most, and soon the tension in the neighborhood began to ease, with people realizing that the world hadn't ended just because one stubborn man decided to fish on his own property. As for me, I found peace again, returning to my evening ritual of casting a line into the shimmering water, watching the sun dip below the horizon as the frogs croaked and the cicadas hummed, savoring not just the quiet joy of fishing, but the knowledge that I had stood up for myself and won. Sometimes, as I sit there with a cold drink in hand, I think about how absurd the whole saga was, how a $200 fine meant to shame me into compliance ended up costing the HOA its stranglehold on the neighborhood, and how Janice, the self-proclaimed queen of the subdivision, lost her crown because she underestimated one man's patience and determination. In a way, I almost feel sorry for her, because if she had simply left me alone that first day by the water, none of this would have happened. But then I remember the smug look on her face when she delivered that violation notice, and the pity evaporates. Now, The lake is mine, the fishing is plentiful, and the neighborhood has learned a valuable lesson about power. When you push someone too far, don't be surprised if they push back harder, smarter, and in a way that changes everything forever. And so, every cast I make, every fish I reel in, feels like a quiet celebration, a reminder that sometimes the best revenge isn't shouting, fighting, or stooping to your enemy's level. It's buying the lake they tried to control and banning the entire neighborhood from it, proving once and for all that freedom is worth fighting for, even if the battlefield is nothing more than a quiet patch of water at the edge of suburbia.